Vítejte u dnešního dílu podcastu Insider. Moje jméno je Michal Půr a je tady se mnou můj kolega Tomáš Jirsa.
Dobrý den. Úvodem bychom chtěli poděkovat všem našim podporovatelům a posluchačům na platformách Patreon a Hero Hero. Díky vám tvoříme tak živou a tak vlivnou komunitu.
Stejně tak patří poděkování našim partnerům a těmi jsou
Advokátní kancelář Rowan Legal a mezinárodní poradenská společnost RSM, váš partner na daně, mzdy a technologická řešení.
Děkujeme.
Tak koho jsme si, Tomáši, dneska pozvali?
Michale, naším dnešním hostem je John O'Sullivan, britský politický komentátor, novinář, spisovatel, blízký spolupracovník premiérky Margaret Thatcherové. Dnes žije v Budapešti, je prezidentem konzervativního Danube institutu, nebo Dunajský institut, který sám založil. So we just made an introduction, John. Welcome to the Insider Podcast.
Thank you very much indeed. Nice to be here. Thank you.
When I think about it, you are the third in a row of, I would say, elite British commentators we had as guests. First, Matthew Goodwin, then Dominic Cummings last year. Now we have the honor to speak with you. So, pleasure.
Well, thank you. And of course, they are two distinguished guests. I'm not sure I'm quite in their class these days, but it's nice to be here.
Well, you are the legend. You are the.
What is it like to be a living legend?
It's unbelievable.
So maybe my question will be a little bit of follow-up on the conversation I had with Dominic Cummings, who said we are at the moment in a revolutionary time period.
Yes,
truly revolutionary. It reminds him, or he said it reminds him, of the revolutions of the 19th century, the revolutionary times. This arrived after, I would say, decades of an illusion of global peace, liberal world order, and the end of history.
Yes,
and history is back. So would you agree with that statement? And how do you see it at this very moment? Where are we heading?
Well, I would say this, that it's Matthew in his last book, I think it's Values, Voters and Virtues. I think he described the revolution that has occurred, but which is now being contested by a counter-revolution in the following way. And I think this is broadly correct. And that is that there has been a silent revolution in British and other institutions in the West, but particularly in Britain, it seems, in which the old meaning has been drained out of them by young, able people who've been indoctrinated into a kind of woke leftism. And before that, a slightly softer cultural Marxism. And have risen in a perfectly natural way. A lot of people would have joined the BBC as graduate trainees, that kind of thing. Historians would rise up in academia. Others would go into institutions like the British Library and the British Museum and the National Trust. And they have gradually transformed them, particularly obviously and clearly since the riots on behalf of defense of George Floyd, commemorating his death. Since that led to a kind of orgy of iconoclasm across the country, A, and B, into the emergence of a set of revolutionary ideas which are a repudiation of Britishness, of British culture, of British history, and so on. Now, I think most people had no idea this kind of quiet revolution was proceeding until all of a sudden it had happened. And since it had happened, and that really became clear, I think, in after 2010 and later, when that became clear, you had a Conservative government in, but it didn't itself realize what had happened until it met certain problems. And secondly, it was itself, so to speak, affected. I don't say infected, but it was partly shaped by some of those same ideas. One of the things which is very noticeable about the British life is the British social attitudes asked MPs of both both right and left, Labour and Conservative, about their attitudes on social questions. And it turned out that the Labour MPs were more left-wing than Labour voters. But what's interesting is that Conservative MPs were more left-wing than Conservative voters. So the entire parliamentary spectrum, and we're talking about the period of the teens, 2010 onwards, that was to the left of the British electorate, and now that's very interesting and very reflects this revolution which has been going on. And I think that what's happened since then was, first of all, it happened here. There were the elections of 2014, which led to the emergence of what we call far-right parties, which are more popularly called, I think, populist or nationalist, or even just simply conservative, could be called Christian Democrats. The emergence of those parties, that was the first thing. The second was the Brexit result. The third was the Trump victory in 2016. All of these things alerted people to what was happening. The Brexit result is interesting because it had two effects. One on the voters was, aha, yes, that's what we did. We now know it. And in fact, in the year or two after the Brexit referendum result, the number of people supporting Brexit increased somewhat because a lot of people said, oh, well, the people spoke, so I'll go along with that. But the elite, the establishments in the BBC, The Guardian, at all, in a sense, the top levels of the economy, cultural institutions, and so on, they reacted with shock. It was a great surprise to them that the policy of European integration and all of the things that went with that had not been popular with the majority of people. They had very little sense. It came as a shock. It came as a shock to David Cameron, the Prime Minister, and the government. I mean, and so. And that shock did not just remain a shock. There was a very strong effort, and I don't think this was planned and coordinated from a single center. It wasn't a conspiracy in that sense. I mean, the 1930s gave us the phrase open conspiracy, and that I think is a very useful phrase. It's a conspiracy in which everyone is perfectly open about it, and yet in a sense you can't therefore in a sense call it a conspiracy because that suggests something happening in secret. And so that I think is a really important factor. But you was a long drawn out battle to make sure that the Brexit result was never implemented from the establishment, from Parliament and elsewhere. But that was resolved, it seemed, by the 2019 election, and then it was subsequently frittered away.
But what do you think is the present and the future of, let's say, conservative, right-wing, or however we want to call them, parties? Because it seems that they are unable to reflect on this tectonic shift in voter perception, and they are leaving huge amounts of political space and, for, let's say, nationalist parties, radical parties. So where is the, what would be the program of, and the style of a modern conservative party?
Well, let me put it this way. I think every country, first of all, is different. I'll look at Britain first, and we can look at other. In Britain, you should be rather happy with this situation because the emergence of the Reform Party, which is, though obviously a lot of people will deny it is, another conservative party, and is but most of its members certainly are former conservatives who feel disappointed by the outcome by the last Conservative government. Now that means that instead of policy formulation and argument and debate occurring, I don't say behind closed doors, that's not the way it is, but within a party, with the discipline of a political party, is occurring in public in front of people like you, and the general public. And because after all, the reform is going to say one thing, and they're going to be criticized by the Conservatives for that, and vice versa. And that will be a bit messy, particularly at first, because it hasn't been done quite this way for some time. The Conservatives have always fought to maintain a monopoly of parties on the right. They didn't want any, because a party on the right cramps their style. It limits their options. There are things they can't do. Maybe they want to appease the left on something. It's harder to do if you have a right-wing rival. And so that means the debate is out in the open, and it's going to be very interesting because when you had Matt Goodwin. Matt Goodwin is one of several really interesting, clever people who are now advising reform. James Orr is another professor of the philosophy of religion at Cambridge, and somebody I think is a highly telegenic and charming and persuasive person. So, as well as being a very, very able mind. So these things are going to be thrashed out in the open, and you should, that means you're in that game, and so are all politics and commentators. So I think that's going to happen. And I think to some extent you're seeing that in Spain and Portugal. You're seeing it in Italy. You're not at the moment seeing it in Germany because the Cordon Sanitaire on AfD means that the Cordon Sanitaire forces the CDU to appease the left. And as you will notice that whenever you have a grand coalition in present years, maybe earlier it might have been different, the grand coalition is a coalition of all the parties that exist, right, centre and left, form an agreement not to have any dealings with the far right or populist or nationalist party. That creates a circumstance in which the centre-right leading centre-right party finds itself continually appeasing the left and continually disappointing its supporters. So that means its supporters then drift away, or they shrink in number. Look at the CDU. It's just climbed back to 30% of the vote in the most recent election. But the one before that was 22%. And back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and teens, the CDU got over 40% on a regular basis. So we see what I call grand coalitionism of that kind. That grand coalitionism in current circumstances means the exile of a party on the right and the drift of the political spectrum otherwise to the left. And the most extravagant result of that is the recent presidential election in Ireland, in which you now have two conservative parties forming the government, and first of all, using party discipline to prevent the appearance on the ballot paper of popular popular independents, the most prominent of whom were clearly more conservative than the current leaderships of those parties. And what's the result? The result is the election of a far-left candidate.
Far left.
Far left, with the support of an organisation, Sinn Féin, which is fundamentally it's the only political party I know that has its own private army. And you might, I would say actually, it's an army which has its own private political party.
So
just like Hamas.
Yeah, it's clear that the left in the United Kingdom and Ireland pose a threat to freedom, free speech, and so on. But from the Central Europe perspective, it looks like that even, I would say, majority of the voters accept it.
You mean
because how is it possible? Even the conservatives. I think the only, I would say, the fighter against the left, it looks like it's the only Nigel Farage, and the Reform UK. So how is it possible? How is it possible that even the conservatives accept threat to free speech and freedom?
I think the conservatives are the ones are reluctant. They're often bullied to it, and I think the rebellion on the right in general, within and outside the Conservative Party, is moving the party into a more libertarian position on speech, and should do so. The Conservative Party in a two-party system, that a major party, in order to win power, has got to encompass a large number of groups. The Conservative Party is a coalition of social conservatives on the one hand, economic conservatives, and what I would call social fabric conservatives. I would distinguish them from social conservatives insofar as their concerns are not primarily moral. I don't say that they have some moral injection, but they look at society and they say, why is crime increasing? What can we do about that? Why is there a loss of faith in institutions? What can we do about that? What's the impact of immigration on our society? What should we do about that? So you have those three groups, and one of whom and the social fabric conservatives tend also to be very strongly defense-oriented as well. They're looking at threats inside and outside the society. So those three groups. Now, obviously, if you're a social conservative, you may not want pornography and so on. And I basically, for example, believe I'm an absolutist or near absolutist believer in free speech on political speech. I don't think it means anything goes in visual pornography or even in written pornography. But obviously, genuine artistic license has to be taken into account there. But still, we don't. Political speech is in a category of its own, it seems to me. So that would be that's my view, and it's the view, I think, of the majority of the Conservative Party. But Theresa May, particularly as Home Secretary, later as Prime Minister, was somewhat authoritarian, and I think the use of public order as a restraint on free speech. There is an element of truth in that. You can't. I think we would agree. It wouldn't be justified to hire a big loudspeaker outside a Jewish member of Parliament's house and broadcast anti-Semitic messages at the house, and that kind of thing would be monstrous, really. And we have to take those kind of things into account. But in general, I think we want people to be able to say what they write and what they wish. And I remember a book, a serious academic book, came out called "Killing No Murder," back in the 60s. And it was seriously discussed in all the book pages. And the argument of the writer was that it is legitimate to kill tyrants. And he was thinking, obviously, the image of Hitler was in his mind. And the question, and now the thing was, I think it was right that such a book should be published, and I think it's right that it should be seriously discussed. And I don't think in the atmosphere of the 60s there was the slightest chance of there were not deranged maniacs around who would read this and say, "Okay, I'm buying a gun now," but that is now taken seriously, and I think that the public order argument in the hands of Mrs. May was much too restrictive and foolish, and secondly, we cannot allow. We no longer have a blasphemy law in relation to Christianity. We are post-Christians, and we are either post-Christian or Christian societies, depending on how you define that. But we are developing a law in which criticism of the Quran or of the Muslim religion and I'm talking here about the religion, the ideas, the beliefs, the values. They ought to be open to criticism as much as any other in our society, and that has got to. So therefore, we have to be clear about that. I would say that the police are not clear about that. The instructions the police are getting and the way they're behaving suggest that they're told there can be no criticism of Islam. Why? Because it would rile people up, rile Muslims up, and we want to prevent that happening. Well, of course, I want to prevent tax either on Muslims or by Muslims. That's obviously common sense. But at the same time, it does not justify, in a liberal society, that has to be arranged by the police arresting those who threaten or attack others. And that's the way we should continue to handle it. We have to recover those kind of self-confident beliefs, which, after all, if you think about it, at the height of, from the period, let us say, 1880 till 1960, which I would say is the most prolonged period of successful public order and minimal crime in Britain. That was achieved. We know it can be done. It's perfectly true. There were very few non-Christians in the society. Well, there's quite a lot of conflict, religious and intellectual, between those Christians that were in the society. We forget the serious divisions between Christianity in those years, but all of them learned to accept the rights of the other to express their view. I don't think it's impossible to persuade our Muslim fellow citizens that they have to tolerate the expression of views they personally find detestable, and most do. So it is a small group of people who convince themselves that their religion should be above criticism, and that's something which, again, if you want to live in our society, we should make plain that it's not tolerable. So the Conservative Party has been acting here as an overindulgent parent trying to prevent the expression of views that's going to cause problems. But having said that, it's got to. We've all got to accept, and we've got to educate ourselves and everybody in the society about the toleration, which is the old-fashioned word for accepting the expression of views you don't like, and I think that can be done. It has been done, and we should do it. And the best way of doing it is not only to do it, but to explain clearly why you're doing it and why you're justified.
Yeah. What would Margaret Thatcher would think of current state of the UK or Conservative Party?
Well, I think she would be very disturbed. She was very disturbed with the state of the country in the 1970s. I don't think the state of the country then was as bad as it is now, partly because there wasn't a new factor which we see, I think, in all of our societies in the West, but particularly I notice it in England and America, and that is the existence of what we call the woke intellectuals. The Chinese call them white leftists. And they are people who in the opinion polls in America are described as very liberal. And now they're not very liberal at all, they're very illiberal, but they're very progressive or very left. And they are the people who form at the extreme people like the Antifa, Red Guards, which is what they are, and use violence and intimidation, and are allowed to do so in cities like Portland by compliant authorities which sympathize with them and anyway want to solidify their own power through the tolerance of violence of that kind. So I'm sorry, I forget where I was going with this, but yes, I think
she would be disturbed.
Sorry?
She would be disturbed.
She would be oh yes, of course, sorry. She would be disturbed by she was disturbed by some aspects of that before she died. And in the period of she was I don't know how many years. She had hang on. Yeah, yes, she had 23 years of life, I think, after she left office. So she continued to write and think for the majority. It's only the last year or two when I saw her not long before her death. I saw her twice in about 6 months, and she was perfectly compass most of the time. She just drifted off every now and then. And the picture of her by Meryl Streep in the movie is a very accurate one. Both the old lady who's slightly losing it, but also the dominant figure. You see her in the House of Commons marching along with a lot of weak, feeble men like me trailing around behind her, and that's it. And I thought Miss Streep caught her in both those periods very, very well, and so much so that although the message of the film was, this is a brave woman, but unfortunately most of the problems and battles she fought, she was partly responsible for, could have been handled more easily by others. That Mrs. Streep's performance just blew that concept out of the water. You just couldn't help but respond strongly and favorably to the picture she presented.
Maybe idea that comes to mind when we are talking about such a strong leader as Margaret Thatcher is what happened even in the most traditional parties like the Conservative Party, that these kind of parties stopped being able to generate strong leaders, because now the comparison between Nigel Farage, whatever we think of him, it's a guy who's able to be very articulate about any given social topic, any given solution he's proposing, and you clearly understand the guy, what he's trying to say and probably what he thinks. Whether on the other hand, when you had the string of conservative leaders, Rishi Sunak comes to mind, you saw this kind of corporate type of guy who's having this specific speech that's he's not saying anything really concrete. So where is this type of people coming from? And it's a European problem. If you look at European institutions, you look at states around Europe not having leaders that are really leaders. Where do you see the root of this?
Well, first of all, Nigel Farage is a remarkable man. He is the most successful political leader in British politics since Margaret Thatcher, without having been a prime minister. Yes, but also without even having been in Parliament until a year ago, and so this is raw political talent. He did, by the way, go to a good school, Dulwich, school in Dulwich, a public school, which produced, among other people, the writers P.G. Wodehouse and Raymond Chandler. So he had a good education. Yeah. But also, I think the reason does not lie so much in what your situation describing, not so much in contrast between Farage and the others. Farage would always be a remarkable person, just is, and a man of very considerable ability who works hard. I mean, I know someone who has worked with him. He works really hard, so it doesn't come easy, but it comes through effort as well. What is merit? Merit is defined in The Rise of the Meritocracy as IQ plus effort equals merit. Yeah. Now, but let's look at the others, the identikit political figures who don't have sharp edges and very emollient and get on. Well, they're not the only people. There are some fiery figures in politics still, and we shouldn't omit that. But the reason for these people goes. Do you remember that debate goes back to the 1960 election? The psychologist in America, I think it's David Reisman, had suggested that modern corporate society produced a kind of figure whom he called other-directed. I forget what the first. There are three stages. I forget the first, but the second was inner-directed. Let's say like a Martin Luther or a figure like that would be the kind of dominant figure, somebody who burns internally with strong intellectual passion, conviction, and who therefore has has followers who are passionately devoted to him and enemies who think he's the son of Satan. Now, so that was the figure whom, in a sense, we educated people to be. We until the end of the Second World War, let us say. Now, as we know, a lot of reactions occurred in society to what had happened in the war and what happened in Germany, and one of them was, I think, a softening of the things we looked for in political leaders. We looked more for compassion than for strength and achievement, and so on. And in everyday social terms, we wanted people who got on with each other. Hence, other-directed versus inner-directed. The problem with what happened to that theory was, in this first outing, the people looked at Richard Nixon and looked at JFK, and they said, JFK is other-directed, Nixon is inner-directed, and I think, first of all, the rest of JFK's career doesn't entirely suggest that's the truth, but there was something there, and he won the election, so. I think political leaders of then have aspired always to stress their compassion rather than I mean, every political leader sometimes has to say, I have very grave news and we're going to have to go through a period of struggle and so on. But it doesn't come naturally to them. Yeah.
It seems that, at least from the Czech perspective, which is started in 1989, we faced, and I was 7 years young when this happened.
Yeah.
But the idea is we are coming for just amazing times, peace everywhere. The idea of democracy and liberalism is winning. We probably don't need those, old school leaders that come and impose that point of view. But it seems that it's, for the last 10 years, it's evident that the times are changing, and the society is not able to react in a way, not being able to generate leaders that face the challenge, which is probably some kind of flaw in the system.
Well, I mean, you had two very different leaders here who changed things. One was Václav Klaus, one was Václav Havel. They're very different styles of approach, and I would say that Havel's was one which is closer to that of a Gandhi figure, the person who is very clear about his morality, his strength of morality, and so on. And Klaus was the figure who said, this is clearly the correct thing. We know serious. We've thought about this a lot. We have to solve the problem this way, and here's what we're going to do. So his was a much more kind of educational leadership. This is a much more leadership by symbol and moral appeal. And both of those are real. But very few people actually can bear the burden. Their lives cannot bear the burden of the moral appeal that Havel made. And very few people actually can bear the burden of the solid, consistent intellectual argument that Klaus gave. So you were just very lucky in having these two people. And so I first of all, you can't, in any system, you can't predict the emergence of people like that, or like Mrs. Thatcher, who was a similar example. Although, when you think about it, any political leader has got to be able to play with both hands of the piano, play the piano with both hands. And Mrs. Thatcher was thought of as a leader of intellectuality and strength. She was also had very strong political, moral passions too, which the two together shaped her. So, one of the things I would say is change your education, go back to the tougher education, and you to some extent, I believe, your education system is still much better than those, certainly of America and now of Britain.
Elementary level.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, fine.
So
I know what you mean. I mean, I mean, you know, if you haven't got it by the age of 15, you're probably not going to get it later.
Yeah. So, as we already said, you are the president of the Danube Institute in Budapest. How do you see the development in Central Europe? Because from our point of view, it could look like we are a few decades behind the Western society. Yeah, there is a huge gap. There is still a huge gap between the society in the Central and Eastern Europe and the Western society. So, what will happen next?
I think first of all, you started way behind in material terms. I mean, you inherited from the communist a wasteland. Really.
It doesn't have to be a bad thing, I would say.
Well, in a way, and so you inherited that. And these countries have caught up very remarkably, but there is still a gap, and some countries have caught up faster than others. The Poles have just done very well lately and are now a major power in Europe. But on the other hand, if you're a Westerner European and you come here and you come to Hungary and Poland, you find societies that are in many ways much healthier. First of all, public safety is much more, it's guaranteed here in a way that it's not. My wife says what a pleasure it is for her and her women friends to have dinner and walk home through late at night without the slightest fear. Another way would be public attitudes to the social institutions, the social and democracy. There is still belief in these things here, and that's because they work better. And you haven't had the wholesale takeover of national institutions by sort of anti-national radicals, as has happened, in America and in Britain. This is very alarming. And throughout the Anglosphere, all of a sudden, what seemed to be the most politically stable and reasonable and working democracies suddenly seem to be infected by a massive. They've just had a massive heart attack of some kind. And that's not true here. So in some ways, you are better off here, and you must fear that if the kind of social determinists are correct, that you're going to be heading in that direction, to the direction of Western Europe, while they're recovering somewhat from their current malaise. So I wouldn't, first of all, be too depressing about where you stand. You've made real progress massively. And I mean, I lived in Prague for 4 years, and I've lived in Budapest for the last 12. And I think there had been improvement in the years before 2007 when I came to live. I was a regular visitor, and now things have got measurably better, and in all kinds of everyday ways. So I think you're in a position to lecture us now.
I think it's true in some ways, but maybe the last thing I want to touch upon is the Europe itself. Of course. Britain went through Brexit, which, as seen from Prague, has, I would say, mixed results both ways, but it didn't end the discussion or where the European institutions should be headed. It seemed for 20, 30 years that it's headed to some kind of federal level, federal concept. It seems at this very present moment that there's a huge backlash against the huge ambitions like a Green Deal and a lot of other stuff that were introduced on the European level. So where do you think this will lead us?
Well, let me begin by pointing out, I've just done it before too, where is the current situation is leading us. It is leading to a kind of, I've called it grand coalitionism, the collaboration of the center left and the center right to keep out the extremes, or in practice to keep out what they call the far right. Okay, and that leads to a government that is increasingly detached from its own supporters. And for the reasons I gave, policy reasons, they start to appease progressives again and again. There's another reason, and it's easier to understand in the British system than in yours, perhaps. Well, don't know. And it's this. Politics is, among other things, an important theatre of national moral debate. Supposing you have just lost an election, and it's 4 or 5 years before the government can change back to your side of politics. Nonetheless, when you turn on the television and watch the parliamentary report or pick up a newspaper, you see the representative of your political views lambasting the government. And the report will sometimes say ministers were embarrassed by the failure of yesterday in Parliament when the leader of the opposition lambasted them effectively. The politics of theatre tells everybody in the society that democracy doesn't stop on the day after of every election. It continues, and they still have hope for the future. And sometimes, by the way, that hope is not really 5 years away. A government can be stopped in its tracks by strong and effective opposition. I mean, they get embarrassed by policies they've adopted which don't work and which the opposition points out to the people that they don't work. And that's very, very important. And so the theatrical element in democracy is something I'm an ex-parliamentary journalist, so I like to report that because I think it has a wider significance than simply the fact that you can oppose things. So that would be my first response.
Yeah, but if you look at the present state of European institutions, where do you think this will go?
Well, of course, there is. I mean, the only time I've seen a real public interest in the proceedings of the European Parliament was when Nigel Farage was there constantly playing Parliament in the EPP.
Like 20 years or something.
Yeah, and that was acting as a parliamentary gadfly, which I have seen several times in the British Parliament, but that was the first time I'd noticed it. And there isn't a genuine debate. The other time was recently when there was, in effect, a confrontation between Ursula von der Leyen on the one hand, who was sitting up there, and Viktor Orban, who was defending himself against attacks from the Commission. And that was a very, very strong moment. Now, there's not enough of that, and that's because the European Parliament isn't really a parliament, and a parliament can't exist unless it has roots in the history of the society. And I mean, obviously, one in which you have to have simultaneous translation into several different languages is not going to be one in which you will have genuinely sort of regular, effective parliamentary debate. So people have to think about what they do about that. My view is that because you can never really solve that problem, that the real democracy will always be in the national parliaments and the national governments, and too much power is being accumulated by Brussels, and a lot of that ought to be returned to the national parliaments. Now, I'm a Brexiteer, but you don't have to be a Brexiteer to be in favor of that kind of restoration of authority from Brussels back to the and that means you have to have a reduction in the amount of legislation, including legislation which is called regulation, to national parliaments, and well, that becomes a more technical argument, but that's key.
Okay.
What if we become? What if we will become more irrelevant? If we will take some rights from the Brussels?
Yeah.
So, because from our perspective, the Czech perspective, it can look like the Britain is losing relevance in the global meaning. Now,
Well, yes. Let me say that, in my view, there might. Well, first of all, I don't think that's true. So I'll explain. which is the leading European power at the moment in terms of Ukraine?
Britain.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's on the biggest problem facing the European continent. So and that's because we actually have nuclear weapons. By the way, if we want to play that role permanently and not simply in a showboaty way, we would really have to spend more on defense in Britain, as just as everybody else does. So there's that point. And secondly, supposing your question is correct, and we are losing authority. Supposing we're gaining, the other side of our losing influence in world politics is that we are gaining genuine democratic decision-making at home, which is what the whole point of Brexit is. We make the decisions, right or wrong. Which would we prefer? I would undoubtedly prefer to be like Switzerland, self-governing but without power, than a country like France, which has a lot of influence in the world, and I'm glad about that in a way, but nonetheless is increasingly hemmed in by European decisions. So that would be my choice.
Okay. So thank you. Thank you for the interview.
And good luck with the
Good luck with
Institute and the Prague visit.
Oh, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
How long did that last?
Almost 1 hour.
Yeah.
Didn't seem that way to me, actually. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a
Thank
good
you.
day.
Chceme vám poděkovat, právě vám, protože vy tvoříte naši skvělou komunitu a řada z vás podporuje Insider několik let. Právě to nám umožňuje tenhle podcast a tuhle celou komunitu rozvíjet a přibírat i nové parťáky, jako je třeba Markéta nebo Vojta.
A taky nám to umožňuje se s vámi potkávat, což máme asi vůbec nejradši. A osobně vás poznat za těch 6 let existence, už je to skutečně hodně lidí, hodně patronů, hodně podporovatelů a za to vám nikdy nepřestaneme být vděční, ať už s námi jste, nejste, anebo teprve budete a děkujeme.
Díky.